All right, very good. Well, all right. Thank you everybody for being here today. I look forward to going through with you our experience thus far in testing XDR solutions, as well as the wonderful adventure we've been on in terms of trying to figure out even what XDR means. That's one of the things that we found in talking with vendors and enterprises is that everybody's got interpretation of XDR, and so it's interesting to put all these different fruit into one basket in a way that makes sense. So in discussing what we've learned from XDR testing, we wanted to do a quick review in terms of the infrastructure that we're using so that you can get a better sense of what the results mean. A quick review of the validation framework, and then introduce some of the scoring metrics that we're looking at. And then we have some anonymized test results that we've lumped together. And I think that's going to be one of the more interesting parts, that and the challenges that we've seen in doing XDR testing. And then lastly, we of course have a call to action for AMTSO members as well as XDR vendors as a group. So in starting off, we wanted to ensure that we had an environment that followed best practices for good security, meaning that we didn't purposely create a vulnerable environment. This is with the goal that if you have good hygiene and then you put a security solution on top of it, you can demonstrate better the security solution's value add versus having an environment that's just completely full of holes. And then, of course, any level of security would improve the situation. This environment, we basically are looking at endpoint, network, and cloud. And then within the environment, we've got it segmented, we've got access controls, and we've got role-based access permissions. Meaning that if you, for instance, we've got different use cases for like the sales team versus the financial team. The sales team will have access only to certain elements within the network and within the cloud, and the sales and the financial team will have different access. So it's not like you compromise one user and then you have the entire keys to the kingdom. You only have the permissions based on the user in order to escalate and try and compromise the environment. In selecting vendors for this test, we took a very simple approach because of all the different definitions of what is multi-vendor, what is single vendor. What we just made it very simple is that if you can go to a particular vendor and cut one PO to get the solution, then it doesn't matter how many different parts are integrated from different vendors to do that. It's just a matter of what's the customer experience look like. Can they go to one vendor, get it stood up, and then be able to manage it and then renew on an easy basis. Fong, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, just really quick, the way that we present this test and this environment to the vendor is that we are actually as an enterprise where we have a headquarters and also the branch office. Obviously, David mentioned about role-based access, in which case we have Active Directory was also prop up as well, so that we can manage who coming in and what kind of role they are and how the information exchanged based on their permissions. So think of us in this environment is as a real enterprise where you have a headquarters, you have a branch office, and you have different type of users. That's how we played out our test case using the vendor technologies to test the vendor technology.
Thank you, Fong.
Yep.
In terms of looking at the validation framework behind the testing, we basically break it down into 5 areas in terms of identifying, detecting, investigating, correlating, and responding. So that's what we're doing at a high level, and it's going to make a little bit more sense once we flesh this out with some of the metrics that we're looking and gathering from these areas. So in terms of the metrics that we're providing as an output from the testing, we're looking at an overall XDR solution score, which then is comprised of the subsections that go into that. First of all, we're looking at, if we start here on the right with identity and detect, we're looking at overall detection accuracy, then going into overall attack investigation accuracy, the XDR security filtering's effectiveness. Basically what that is saying is, if we've got millions of log events, how much can the solution distill down all that activity into interesting events and then into actionable alerts? Threat correlation index and threat classification fidelity basically help us understand how these threats map to certain frameworks, such as like MITRE or NIST. How accurate is that? And then how accurate are the solutions in determining the critical nature of the threats, so that then you can respond appropriately and triage them accurately. And then we're looking at overall incident response score, and basically that's looking at, does the solution provide some guidance in response? Is it accurate? Are the responses suggested then functional when you go to execute them? And then lastly, in response, you want to be resistant to false positive. A big thing we're hearing when talking with enterprise customers is that they don't want to deal with a lot of noise. And so if they're going down a lot of false rabbit holes, they're going to be upset with the solution. So how resistant is the XDR solution to false positives? Lastly, we're looking at some metrics in terms of the time to deploy. Is this a solution that can be stood up quickly? Does it have a long learning process with its machine or AI capabilities? Then we're looking at what's the maximum time to detect, and also that correlates to the maximum attack dwell time. Fong, did you have something else you'd like to add on this part?
Yeah, so just real quick, the way that if you look at this, like the way we test it, we are acting as if we are the SOC team, right? We got to be able to, the technologies, the way that we test, we want to be able to provide a score, how the technology going to be able to detect, identify, detect the threats, and then how the technology will be able to correlate that information and filter out a lot of noise before it's actually bring the incident back to the SOC team, so that the SOC team will be able to validate or detect the right appropriate action. So the way you look at it, it's a holistic approach that we look at, and also we look at the XDR solution from the definition of what it is. It's basically bringing the endpoint, it's bringing in the security infrastructures, it's bringing in SOAR technologies, and also we evaluate based on the accuracies and the security filtering effectiveness. Basically remove the noise and basically bringing in the right incident to the SOC team so that they can evaluate and address the issue. So in summary, it's we look at it from a holistic point of view. Thanks, David.
Thank you. So now the exciting part in terms of some of the results that we're seeing, aggregating all of the results so far together. Overall XDR solution score, doing quite well in terms of we've baselined other technologies, and it's doing comparatively well to some of the other technologies that we baseline when we've tested in the past. Overall detection accuracy as well as incident response scores also decent. Where the solution seems to struggle a lot with overall attack investigation accuracy in terms of how it maps to other attacks, as well as how the recommendations for the critical nature of the attacks. We were pleasantly surprised with how resistant these solutions were to false positive. Given there is some learning phase that the solutions need in order to attain that. Fong, anything else you want to add here?
No, actually.
So this is just splitting things down a little bit more in terms of how the solutions did, and so in terms of reducing the amount of noise that organizations would deal with when you're talking about millions of logging activities, and then bringing that down to basically either a couple thousand or even less events, it does a lot to reduce the workload on the incident response team. So we're seeing fairly effective at filtering out a lot of the noise, although there is some opportunity for the solutions that we looked at to improve in terms of how they map back to some of these threats to some of the other frameworks, or even the critical nature of those threats. And the incident response, not so exciting in terms of scores. They seem decent. It mostly capable in terms of giving a notification that can then take that ticket and either reassign it or suppress that if it's something that turns out not to be an issue. Once again, incident response recommendations. Does the solution actually provide recommendations, and then do those response actions actually work?
Yep.
And then just going into a little bit more details of some of the metrics that we're looking at from an operational efficiency standpoint. Things, it's a little bit all over, but the solutions in terms of access control were overall good. Compliance management, it seemed to be a strong point as well. And then just the manner in which the security metrics are reporting and the capability of those consoles provided what we're looking for in terms of the feedback we had from enterprises from what they wanted to see reported on. Was there anything you wanted to add on this section?
No, the only thing I want to kind of point out is that, with XDR, it's a solution. It's a layer of different technologies, security technologies from endpoint, identity and access management, network infrastructures, and also cloud security, right? If you look at the integration, it's very interesting to see that, the overall score here that David mentions, 72%. To me, that's that's a very good indicator for any enterprise when they think about XDR solution, because this is what their SOC team or their the IT security team need to be able to understand and be able to know how the integrations of the solutions that was done well or done deep improvement from the vendor technology perspective. So that's one thing that I like to point out. But other than that, there's a lot of information here to digest. But one of the key things is about integrations of the different layers, security layer technologies, solutions.
David, can I jump in with a question?
Sure.
Okay, we've been through years now of malware tests where malware test reports are reporting 97, 98, 99, and then fractionally thereof compliance against the tests that are run. So the shading of difference has become relatively narrow. I think this is really positive that we're suddenly seeing a spread out of the spectrum. It's refreshing to see tests which are reporting a much broader scale, 75%, 65%, et cetera. Have you gotten, what do you think we have to do in terms of, I'll say, retraining the marketplace or teaching folks that these scores are actually more informative, perhaps, than getting up in the 90s, yeah?
Yeah, there is a level, like in working with some of these vendors, they're like, hey, this isn't 100%, and that really scared them. And so then even working with vendors, there's been an opportunity for this discussion that you're talking about, Scott, where we're so accustomed to, and marketing's pushing so much for the 100%, or 99.99999%, where it's I don't have the answer in terms of how to re-engineer the market's expectations. And I mean, I have some ideas here, but I don't think it's a cure-all. It's really, you have to, in talking with the end user, what's important to them. Because
I think that's really important. I think this is going from the translation from putting a tick in the box to say, yep, you were tested, to putting something in the CISO's hand or the IT director's hand that's more meaningful in terms of testing, right? If everything is within 1% of perfect, that's great, and it means we've moved the needle forward. But the next step in this market is XDR, and seeing that kind of spread's kind of important. So I without seeing the underpinning companies that were involved, it's just refreshing to see a broader spread of calculated values. Yeah.
And also it gets into the nature of the attacks, where with using the tactics and techniques and persistence, it's a different ball game than looking at antivirus and those capabilities. So in broadening the playing field, we've changed a lot of what's going on, and you rightfully point out that there needs to be a conversation. I think AMTSO would be a great place to start this as we're rolling out the XDR standards. What kind of results are we going to be seeing, and how would we interpret that? Because a solution that hits, let's say, overall 88% in terms of their XDR solution score, the way we do it, might not be the right solution, because they want something that does better on the response side than maybe something that just is really strong detection and might have weak hunting and weak incident response part of the solution. So it's got to be a broader conversation than just, hey, you hit some great numbers. Of course, this is the guy to go with. And going into that even further is like, you got to also look at the operation side. Maybe you have something that has, let's say, 100% or a higher score, but then takes a lot longer time to train and is a lot more difficult to set up and needs a dedicated team to operate it. And so there's a lot more conversations than just, hey, check the box 100%, like you said. And that was actually, Fong points out with the integration, some of the things that we're finding in terms of researching and working with vendors and talking with enterprises is that when we're engaging with vendors, it was not uncommon for us to get in front of like an endpoint or networking team, and then they're like, oh, let me connect you now with the other portion, the other team that needs to be part of this. And we would see oftentimes communications start to slide when other teams needed to be brought in, and that there wasn't just like Fong likes this expression. I think it's funny because my background in jiu-jitsu. So it's good to have one throat to choke. And with the way XDR is managed as a product and even as support, it's very siloed, is what we're finding, working with the different vendors. The other thing we're seeing is visibility across the attack scenarios. So basically we're running 41 different attack scenarios with 3 to 10 major steps, and each of those steps or each of those blocks has like activities that form that step or that block. And what we were seeing is that it was very interesting to see how different solutions might be better at the initial phase or the middle phase or the end phase, and that it wasn't necessarily a solid view across the entire attack. So we thought that was interesting from result of testing. As Fong pointed out, there were issues in terms of just the integrations of the different solutions that are coming together to form XDR, and just from the business side of having to interact with different teams and seeing the communication break down there, it wasn't extremely surprising to see that there was also then issues on the technology integration as well. Single pane of glass with mapping to all the different minor tactics and techniques. We found that chasing after that might put a lot of undue burden on vendors that could have been focused on other areas that would help the enterprises. And then we're looking at just how the market's consolidating the technology, and even with vendors, enterprises, even government agencies, not really sure what XDR is. It's still interesting to see that there's a lot of buzz about it, and that it's something that enterprises are looking to get the most out of, and then they're interested in the differentiation between the different vendors. Fong, did you have something you want to add here too?
No, I think you cover pretty much a lot of it, but the only one thing that I want to point out again is the top bullet that talks about the silo technologies. Obviously, when we work with different vendors, there's certain vendors that have all the technologies that define in the XDR frameworks, endpoint, identity, asset management, network security, and cloud security, and things like that. They pulled it together, but still in the way that they develop the product, it's still kind of a silo when we interface with these vendors. And there are some other vendors that they have majority of the XDR security layer components, but then they bring in the external or partnership with other vendors. So it's very interesting to, from observation or from our engagement with these vendors, that we learned that these technologies is still kind of a silo. It's not work as a system, the way that you want to treat it at XDR. To me, XDR is a system, right? You get different components of security there to provide, to mitigate the attack surface. Depends on what technology or what area you're looking at. Endpoint, identity and access management, network security, cloud security, for instance. I think it's still, the operations there from a vendor perspective, still a little bit of a silo. Not tight integrations from a system approach perspective. They are in the process of doing that. So that's the observations that I've seen. Thanks, David.
And the motivation or the inspiration for the is this XDR meme came from a conversation we had with a smaller vendor where the CMO said they didn't have an XDR solution, while the CEO said they did have an XDR solution. So even within companies that may or may not be selling XDR, there's confusion on what XDR means.
Yeah.
So while we're engaging with different vendors on the topic of XDR, we decided to creatively come up with some anonymized names, just because we want to make sure we honor our NDAs in place. So we're seeing 4 basic areas of challenges in terms of being able to purchase solutions, get them up and running, and then the area that we saw the most issue is essentially, vendors are concerned about what we're going to do to their baby.
Yep.
And that is, what are the actual metrics? How is this going to play out? What happens if our solution just doesn't work with the test harness? There's a lot of questions about just how things would play out with the testing itself. And then lastly, there were solutions in terms of just like operational challenges, and then single pane of glass just not mapping back to the right frameworks. So did you have anything you wanted to add, Fong?
Yeah, I think you hit that, but I just want to stress it again. From XDR perspective, we mentioned that it's act like a system, right? So it's a natural fear from any vendor who built the product. How good, the questions in their minds is they know how good they do the integrations in terms of portal and different technologies. And then that turned into the questions when we as a test organization come to them and say, you know what, we want to test, we want to work with you and test your technology. So the natural fear comes in. So there's a lot of questions from a vendor's perspective. How do you score me in this area? How do you score me, in certain, how do you score? For example, we're talking about effective security effectiveness, right? How do you score that there's multi-millions of incidents? How do you come up with those metrics? How do you score that? So that was, that takes quite a bit of a long conversation to engage with the vendors and onboard them to do the out test. And I think it's natural, if I was a vendor, from a vendor perspective, those are the fair questions that they ask. But this is, for us, we've learned quite a bit from engaging with these vendors as well. All right, David.
So in terms of our call to action, at the very least, we recommend, if you're in the XDR space or planning to be in the XDR space, that you join the AMTSO XDR standards working group and make sure that your voice is heard as AMTSO builds out our standard for XDR testing. Just a little bit up from that is just make sure that your solution is easy to procure. And lastly, at the very top, we've gone through great lengths to work with vendors in the development of our methodology and the execution of our tests, and do it in a way that allows for the very best for vendors. That we don't want to set this up on our own and then test it. We want vendors to be involved just like they would with a customer in terms of ensuring that we've configured the solutions properly for the environment that we're in. Maybe that's one thing we could have pointed out, is that results are heavily dependent on configuration, more so than other solutions that we've tested in the past because of the integrations that are involved. If you're slightly off on each parts of that solution stack, the net effect is much greater than if you just have one tool that could be tuned more optimal. So we really want vendors to ask the questions. That don't be shy, because we've seen a lot of vendors are concerned about the test metrics and how is it going to be scored. It's like don't stop the conversation. Once you get to a point where you're unsure, so let's continue the conversation. And if you don't like what we're saying, provide feedback so that we can adjust. We are not trying to test this in a vacuum. We believe that the industry is full of experts, and it would be silly for us to think that we know everything. We really want to work in a collaborative manner instead of doing involuntary XDR testing. We want to be voluntary. We want to work hand in hand. If we find a problem and it makes sense not to publish, then we won't publish, or we do some sort of anonymized version. There are a lot of options for us in terms of working with vendors to make sure that they aren't penalized for working with us with the test results. So I'll get off my soapbox now. Phong, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think, from we talked earlier that, how we prop up our test environment, looking from a holistic approach perspective. The message to the vendor is that, they use, work with us in terms of treating us like an enterprise, that looking at a different aspect of XDR. Obviously, when you build a product from a vendor perspective, you sell the product, you work with, you do proof of concept with the customer, but every customer environment is different. Some may require more heavier on the identity and access management solutions. The other might, require more emphasis on the EDR or endpoint solutions, or cloud security, so on and so on. However, working with us, we prop up an enterprise environment that address all of these aspects, from, basically attack surface, from endpoint to identity and access management, cloud security. We want to work with the vendors, in terms of working with them to bolster their XDR solution from different aspects of the security. They can engage with us in that, and basically also on the other end, also help us in terms of understanding, the area that we need to bolster on our test environment as well. So it's a mutual thing, and I really encourage vendors to to participate with AMTSOs, working with AMTSO and working with us in terms of creating the standard for XDR testing.
Thank you, Phong. So with that, I know we had some questions earlier on, but happy to answer questions at this point.